For the double pinwheel block, we have 3 pieces of fabric. We have a dark green, it's so dark it's almost black. We have a gold square and a red square. To start, I am going to clean cut 2 edges of my dark green strip. And then I need to cut it down to 4 inches wide. I'm going to line up my 4-inch mark on that long straight edge and any line on the, I could line up my 10-inch mark because that's all I'm going to need. Going 10 and the 4. And the first piece I need off of here is a 4-inch square. So I'm going to back this up to the 6-inch mark and line up my straight lines along the edge, cut, and then I need 4 1.5-inch strips, so I'm going to back off. I need to stay in the camera so you can see it. I'm going to back off to the 4.5-inch mark, and then to the 3, and finally to the 1.5. So there are my pieces. From both the red and the gold square, I want a 4-inch square, so I'm just going to cut both of them at once. Going to clean cut 2 edges. You could pick up the mat. I'm going to be bad. Rotate and cut it down to 4 inches square. And if you're not comfortable cutting 2 at a time, then just cut them 1 at a time exactly the same way. I have all 3 of my 4-inch squares stacked up here. Again, you can do this 1 at a time if you want to. We are going to cut them in half twice on the diagonal, so once each direction. If I don't move that, then I can cut the other way. So now each of those 4-inch squares ends up being 4 triangles. We're going to sew our red and dark green triangles together along a short edge. Our green triangles need to be on the left and our red on the right. Be careful when you're sewing these because our short edges are biased, so don't stretch them out of shape. Once they're sewn together, we're going to press toward the green. Again, be careful because it is on the bias. And we're going to take our gold triangles and our dark green strips, and you want to line up the short edge of the dark green strip with the top of my gold triangle, and we're going to sew those together. And yes, your green strip is longer. Here's my green strips sewn to my gold. I pressed toward the green strips, and now, and again, the short edges are biased, so be gentle. Now we're going to extend the long edge of the gold into the green. So just line up the edge of your ruler with your gold, and run on down and cut it off so you end up with a triangle on all 4 of the gold and green units. So I'll finish those off camera. The next thing we're going to do is sew our triangles together like this. We will be trimming them down, so just center them the best you can. Once we have our 4 units, we're going to press toward the red and the green side, and then we need to trim this down to a 3-inch square. You can either use a square ruler, in which case half of 3 inches is 1.5. So I want that 1.5 mark right here on that center. So I'm going to put my diagonal on that seam and the 1.5 mark right there. I'm going to trim, and then rotate. Again, the diagonal line can be on that seam, and now I'm going to put my 3-inch marks on the edges that I just cut. And that's how you would trim it with a square ruler. There is a ruler called a Tucker trimmer that is made for trimming blocks made of like hourglass blocks, or ones that are half of a quarter square triangle. Let me just see if I can find. So like these guys, the hourglass, also these that are a quarter square and a half square triangle. So it's marked to cut both 1/2 inch increments and whole. I'm going to cut down to the 3-inch, so I would be using, this is upside down, I would be using the 3-inch line. So to use this ruler, I would line up the diagonal here and also the diagonal here. If that continued on and was an hourglass block, it would go all the way across. So here and here. So it's marking the centers of the different sizes that I'm cutting down. I don't have to look for it on the ruler. Then I would rotate and again line up the 3-inch mark, the diagonal here and here, and trim. So let me do that to one more. I'm making the 3-inch, so this is the middle of my 3-inch. I'm lining up the line here on this diagonal and also on this diagonal, and trim. And trim. So I'm going to trim all 4 blocks down to 3 inches. So now we're ready to sew our units together into a 4-patch. So sew 2 together and in pairs, and then we'll come back and sew the center seam. I have my pairs sewn together and I pressed toward the gold, and now I'm just going to sew the rows together, and I'm going to want to match these points. So when I flip it over, really should match if you had an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can put a pin through here and then through to the other side, make sure it lines up, and then pin on both sides of that pin and stitch. Okay, I popped my center seam so that I could press doing a pinwheel. I will say that on this one it wasn't terribly cooperative, so if you're having trouble getting it to pop, you could always press this seam open, and there is the finished double pinwheel block. For the dandy quilt block, we have 3 pieces of fabric. We have 2 blacks that are the same print and a gold print. One of the black pieces is thinner and longer than the other. So from that skinniest one, we're going to trim this down to 1.5 inches wide. So I'm just folding mine because I'm working on a small surface. So 1.5, and I do need to clean up my short edge. I should have done it when I cut my other side. Just making sure it's really 1.5. Okay. And I need to clean off this end, and because mine's folded, I'm going to be cutting 2 squares at a time. We need 8 1.5 inch squares. So it's folded, so 4 times 1.5 is 6 inches. So I'm going to line up my 6 inch mark on this short end that I just clean cut. Then I'm going to back off to the 4.5 inch mark, cut, and the 3 inch mark, cut, and then finally the 1.5 inch mark. And because this was folded in half, I now have my 8 1.5 inch squares. You need to trim the gold strip down to 2.5 inches wide, and again I have my piece folded. So I'm going to trim and trim the short end as well to clean it all up. We are going to be cutting 6 2.5 inch squares from this. So I'm going to be lining my 2.5 inch mark up here. But since I have this folded in half, I need to know 2.5 times 3, which is 7.5. So I'm going to line up my 2.5 inch mark here, my 7.5 inch mark here, and cut. And then I'm going to move my ruler back to the 5 inch mark, and just like I've told you all year long, I'm keeping lines on the long edges to keep everything straight. And then I move back to the 2.5 inch mark and cut, and that gives me my 6 2.5 inch squares. On the wrong side of all 8 of the 1.5 inch black squares, we're going to mark one diagonal line. I am using a sandpaper board. I have mentioned this before in the videos, and that just helps to keep my fabric from shifting around. Any straight edge will do, and we want just one line. It's not take your pick this time, it's just one. I'm using a mechanical pencil. I can see it. It probably doesn't show up super well on camera, but just one line, corner to corner. Then we are going to take 4 of the gold squares that we cut, and the first step is going to be to put one of the black squares in one corner, and we want to sew just a thread's width in the seam allowance, so toward the corner, away from that line. So if we sew exactly on the line, then you probably won't have enough to fold it all the way out. We're putting corners on this gold thing, so just a thread's width inside that line. I've stitched just to the edge of the line out toward the corner, and rather than cutting it off your excess right now, I prefer to press it before I trim it, because when I do that, I can make sure that what I'm pressing is going all the way to the edge of that square, because if it's short, I would like the chance to correct it. So once I'm happy with it, we're going to just trim off the extra, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll do that to all 4 units. And then we are going to take our remaining 4 black squares that we've already marked with a line, and we're going to put them on a corner next to this corner, so that we'll be sewing across this way. Again, I'm sewing just to the edge of that line by about a thread's width, and it's out toward the corner. I'm treating this corner exactly the way as I did the last one. I've stitched, I pressed, and when I'm satisfied that that's going all the way to the edge, then I'm going to trim off my excess behind that corner. So I'll have 4 units that look like this, and they should be 2.5 inches square because our square was 2.5. But we're not going to leave it 2.5 inches square. We're going to make this into a rectangle. So we're going to cut off the bottom off the gold. So we want it to be 2 inches tall. So I'm lining up my 2 inch mark here with the top, and I'm trying to keep lines here to keep it straight. And we're going to do that on all 4. So again, the 2 inch mark is across the top, and I'm putting lines, and if it's not perfectly straight, I'm lining up with the gold because I know that one was square. And trim. From our remaining black strip, we need to cut out 3 2.5 inch squares. So I'm going to square it up, and 2.5 times 3 is 7.5. So I'm going to cut this to a 2.5 by 7.5 inch rectangle. And then I can back my ruler up to the 5 inch mark. And then the 2.5 inch mark, and that gives me my 3 squares. Now one of these squares is going to be the center of the blocks. Just set it aside. We're going to make half square triangle units out of our remaining gold square and the two of the black squares. So you can either mark one line through the center, and so 1/4 of an inch away from that line on both sides, or you can use a tool like the magic wand, line your center up on the points, and then draw a line on both sides, and then you would stitch on those lines. So we will take that gold piece, put it right sides together with the black pieces, and we'll be making 2 of these, and stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the center, either way you marked it. We've made half square triangle units like this several times this year. So I've sewn my 2 lines, and I'm going to cut it in half between those 2 lines. Then I will press toward the black, which I have already done on this one. And now this needs to be trimmed down to a 2-inch square. You can just use a regular square ruler if you want to. You're not going to have a ton to cut off. I'm using the block lock, so as always I want the point to be riding on the seam. I want to make sure I still have a little bit extra beyond the 2-inch mark before I make my first cut. I'm going to twist it around, slide the ruler back to the 2-inch mark this time, and trim off the remaining 2 sides. And I will do that to all 4 half square triangle units. Now we're ready to put the block together in a slightly irregular 9 patch. So you're going to do a row, and another row. I will be sewing, well, it doesn't really matter on the rows when I get, yes it does. On this one I will be sewing with this unit on top so that I can see this intersection and make sure I keep my point. My rows are sewn together. I pressed in toward the center on the center row, and then out away from the center on the top and bottom rows. So now all I have to do is sew my rows together. I will be sewing with the top and bottom rows on top again so that I can see this point to keep my corner, and my seams are pressed in opposite directions, so they should just nest right here and here, and those are my match points. Here's my finished dandy quilt block. It should be 5.5 inches finished. My final pressing was in toward the center, and that is our last 5.5 inch block for this year. For our Saltbox house, we have 2 squares of brown fabric. One of them is bigger than the other by about 1 inch. We have what she's calling a beige rectangle. These are going to be the windows. We have a bigger red rectangle. That's going to be our door. What she's calling a red gingham rectangle is this one. That will be our roof. And then we also have a small red rectangle. That's the chimneys. In addition to that, you have 1.5 yards of fabric that's going to be the background for your borders. We will be cutting the sky out of this piece of fabric. I'm going to cut my biggest square down so that it's 7 inches wide. And I do want to clean up one edge. So go here and one end. I'm going to cut just one of the other sides down so that it's the whole piece is 7 inches wide. If you care about direction, it's not really a big deal on this print, but you could make it a big deal if you want to. From this, I need 3 strips that are 7 inches long by 1.5 wide. So 1.5 times 3 is 4.5. So I'm going to cut off a 4.5 inch section. I'm keeping lines on my sides that I'm not cutting. Cut. I'm going to back off to 3 inches and cut, and then back off to 1.5. So I need those strips. And then out of this piece, I want to cut a rectangle that's 2 1/8 wide by 3 1/2, so I can get my 2 3 1/2 inches from that 7-inch strip I cut. So I'm going to go 2 1/8. So this is kind of a fussy measurement. 2 1/8. This is scrap, and I'm going to back off to my 3 1/2 inch mark and cut my smaller square of brown. I'm going to cut into a 5 1/2 by 6-inch rectangle. So I'm going to clean up 2 sides. So my 5 1/2 inch mark is going to go along one edge, and then I want my 6-inch mark to go around along the other edge that I clean cut. And cut. And then from this, I'm cutting 1 1/2 inch strips. They're going to be 5 1/2 long. So I'm backing this up to 4 1/2. And then 3. And then 1 1/2. And you know what? Directional is a pain on this. Mine is not going to be. The flower is going to just be turned any which way, and it's not going to make any difference. So I have 4 1 1/2 by 5 1/2 inch long strips. For my piece that is for the windows, which is a kind of a creamy beige grunge, I need to cut a rectangle that is 3 by 7. So I'm going to clean up my first 2 edges. Along the long edge, I'm lining up my 3-inch mark. On the short edge, I'm lining up my 7-inch mark. Cut and cut, and I'm cutting this in half, so I have 1 1/2 inch strips. So I'm putting my 1 1/2 inch mark on the long edge and cut. The bigger red rectangle, which is for the door, we are going to trim down to 2 1/4 wide by 3 1/2 long. So just clean up 2 sides. And it's 2 1/4 wide, 3 1/2 long. There we go. I'm going to take my 7-inch long brown strips and alternate them with my 7-inch long window pieces, and I'll just sew those together along the long edges. After sewing these strips together, I pressed toward the brown, and then from this we are cutting 3 2 1/4 inch strips. So we're going to, oh, and this should be 5 1/2 inches this way. Mine's close, it's not exact. So I'm lining up a line with the seams best I can. I'm going to slice off one edge to clean it up. Then I need 2 1/4, so times 3, that is 6 3/4. Wow. And you're gonna, and going to trim, come back to 4 1/2. And trim, and then back to 2 1/4, cut, so we have 3 pieces that look like this. Then we're going to take our 1.5 by 5.5 inch pieces. It's going to go here. It's going to go between each of these, stacking them on top of each other. Whoops. And then one on top, and you're not seeing all that in the camera. So from bottom all the way to the top, and we'll sew all those together. After sewing the window units between the brown strips, I pressed everything toward the brown. So now we're ready to do the bottom part of the house. We have our 2 brown rectangles still and our red piece that we cut for the door. So they are just going to get sewn together with the red door piece in the middle. After sewing the red piece between the 2 brown pieces, press in toward the red, and now this piece gets sewn to the bottom of the section with the windows in it. From your 1.5 yards of background fabric, you're going to want to cut a section off of one end that is 5.5 by 16. So I'm just kind of using my cutting board to get to the 16. This doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be cutting this down, but do just cut it off of one end of your border fabric. We're going to be cutting the borders out of it. This is the last piece it says to cut out of the border fabric, but I'm cutting it out first. I will draw a diagram and put it in your kits on how I cut my pieces out of that rectangle of background fabric I cut. I'm going to cut one strip off that is 1 3/4 by the width of it, so about 16 inches. I have mine folded in half now. And we're just going to, after we cut this, set it aside. So just hold on to that piece. The roof is actually foundation pieced. I thought we had done all our foundation piecing the one month we did it. But this is the pattern, and I have copied it onto foundation paper just because it's easier to remove, but you could use regular paper. These are the pieces we're using. This is for the chimneys, this is the roof, and this is the background fabric. And she hasn't had us pre-cut background fabric strips. So what I'm going to do is cut a piece that's 1 3/4, let's say 7 inches off of here. I think that's going to be enough, but if it's not, I can use what's down here too. Cut that and that. And the rest of it I will use later. And I'm going to do the chimney section first, which is up here on the top. I'm just going to cut it off of there. And remember, when we're foundation piecing, we're going from number 1, then 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. So number 1 on this piece is right here in the center. So that is background fabric. So we're going to flip it over on the first piece, and it's going to be the wrong side of the fabric against the foundation. I want to make sure that I have 1/4 of an inch beyond whatever my second line is. It would actually be this one if I'm following the numbering. And then I would pin this in place. I don't have any handy at this moment, so you're going to imagine the pins. And then my next piece is the chimney, A2. So that piece I will put on here right sides together with the background fabric. I will pin that so it doesn't shift while I'm sewing. Then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and just sew on that line. I start a little bit before the line out here in the seam allowance, stitch right on top of the line, and then a little bit off the line. I do usually shorten my stitch length to about a 1.5. If you want to, a bigger needle can help you tear away the paper later. I stitched on the line, and then I'm using the add 1/4 plus to trim down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm putting the beveled edge right there on that line, folding back, and then I pull it out, and there's a grooved edge, and that groove is going right there on that folded paper. And I will trim, and then I'm going to press this way. I'm just going to go ahead and cut half of this off for right now so I can show this without having to run back and forth to the ironing surface. Now on the other end, my number 3 piece is the chimney on this end. So I'm going to go ahead and put my beveled edge of the add a quarter plus on the line between A1 and A3. I'm going to fold back on that line, and I'm going to pre-trim this edge. And the reason I'm doing that is because then when I go to match up my other chimney piece, I can match my raw edges here, and I will pin that in place, and then I'll flip it over and stitch on this line. Alright, I've sewn my two pieces for the chimneys onto the two sides, and I have pressed both of them. I'm going to go ahead, and I could go ahead and trim and check these seam allowances again, but I already have trimmed one, and the other one I pre-trimmed, and I'm fine with it. But if it gets a little bit off, you can retrim it. So I'm going to put the beveled edge of my add a quarter plus on the line between A2 and A4. Fold back, and then flip it over to the grooved side and put that against the folded paper and cut. So I'm pre-trimming my 1/4 inch seam allowance there. I'm going to go ahead and do the other one at the same time. So this time between the A3 and the A5. Fold back. Put the grooved edge on the folded paper. And then I have this piece left of that background strip I cut, so I'm going to cut it in half. So it's going to match up on the ends, so 7 inches was plenty on that strip I cut. I will match up the short edges, flip it over, and sew on the line, and I'll do that on both ends. For the roof piece, I'm using this piece with the stripe in it, and I'm going to put the wrong side of that against the wrong side of my paper. If I can, I want to keep my stripes straight, although I don't guarantee that it will stay that way. So I'm pinning it in place, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-trim this by putting my add a quarter plus beveled edge on the line between B1 and B2. I'm going to fold back on that line, and then I'm going to trim off the 1/4 inch. And I have this whole piece left, and this one can be a tricky angle, so I know I want it to go, that I need it to butt up here. So what I'm doing is laying both of these wrong sides up, and I'm going to go ahead and trim that angle into my background fabric. So then when I go to match this, I can do it here, and most likely I'm going to need a little point sticking out there. I'm going to open this up, and I can test this by folding back on about what's the 1/4 inch. So I don't want as much sticking out down here as I thought. Let's move this down. Try it again, and this is just a estimate, and this is when paper piecing becomes tricky. That's pretty good, so I will go ahead and match that up and sew that edge. And to do that, I'm going to pin it in place, and I'm going to flip it over and sew on this line. Okay, I sewed the background on the line on this side, and it covered nicely. That's what we want. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to go ahead and cut my background off just beyond my foundation. So now I want to do exactly the same thing again to get that angle in there. I'm going to put my beveled edge of my add a quarter plus on the line, fold this back, then the grooved edge goes on the fold of that paper, slice it off, and now I'm going to take my background fabric, and I'm just going to slide it under there, both wrong sides up on both of them. And to get that angle, I'm just going to cut right there. You don't have to do the angle, but it just makes it a lot easier to get it on there to cover. So then again, I'm going to put it right sides together with the roof on this side. I'm going to fold it back about where the 1/4 of an inch would be and check it, and that looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to put it there, and I will pin it in place from this side. Sorry, I'm probably moving right out of the camera range. So I'm going to pin it in place, and I'm going to sew on this line. All right, I have sewn my piece onto the other end, and I'm ready to cut it off. I could wait to do this till I trim the whole block, but we're going to just get it out of the way. Now, I've talked about this when we did paper piecing before, foundation piecing. I like to stitch around the whole section when it's finished inside the seam allowance, because that way when I'm putting it together it's not going to flip up on me or whatever. So here you can see it on this side, and here you can see it on the right side. Did the same thing. So we're ready to trim this down. It does have the 1/4 inch marking right here. I like to double check that by putting my 1/4 inch mark of the ruler on the stitching line, which is the dark solid one. So I'm going to put that on the stitching line and trim, and I'm just going to do that on all 4 sides of both pieces. So 1/4 of an inch and trim. So I'll finish that off camera. Now I have my chimney piece and my roof piece all trimmed up, and they're going to just go together, right sides together along that long edge. And this point on the chimney should be matching with the roof on the angle. That's why the paper piecing or foundation piecing, you'll be more accurate with this. So I'm going to put a pin through that point, and I want to come through on this point on the other side, and I'm going to put a pin on both sides of that to hold it, and then I will do exactly the same thing down on this end. That's this one, through this point, and then through to the other side, and that same where it's matching up, and I'll pin both sides on that one. And then I'm just going to take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew along that line, and I'm going to sew off the edge all the way to the edge of the fabric straight across. I've sewn my chimney to the top of the roof, and I press toward the roof. I just wanted to show you to take out the paper, and I already took it out of the seam allowance on that side. I like to use a seam ripper, the back side of it, and just score along my stitching lines, and then the paper peels off easier. I don't usually take the paper off the pattern until I have completely enclosed whatever part the paper is on. And this is my least favorite part of paper foundation piecing, is taking the paper out, because it makes a mess. Anyway, so once we have our roof and our chimney section, it is going to get sewn to the top of the rest of the house. So same width, we're going to just match it up and sew on the long edge. I pressed my seam down toward the brown. I didn't even look to see what the pattern said. At this point, this block should be 5.5 inches wide by 15 3/4 long. So that 1 3/4 inch piece of fabric that we set aside, we want to cut it to 15 3/4. If your house block wasn't 15 3/4, you should trim this down to what size it is, because we're going to be adding border above this, so you could always adjust there for your difference. Mine's close enough to 15 3/4. So half of 15 3/4 is 7 7/8. And I have mine folded in half just because I'm using a short ruler. If you're using a long one, just cut it to length. I'm going to cut, and then we're going to sew this piece to the right side of our house. So mine's a little bit short, so I will shorten that up just a hair. Here's my finished Saltbox house. If it's not exactly 15 3/4 this way, that's okay, but you do want 6.5 inches this way. I did want to show you, I can now remove the paper here and here because those pieces are completely enclosed. So besides the seam ripper, another way to help you is to pop it like that, pull the seams, and it should pop away from the seams. The bigger pieces especially will do that, work well. But I'm leaving the paper in until I have the seams sewn on all sides so those two could come out. So this concludes your required homework for this month. However, the video is going to continue because I'm going to show you how to start putting your quilt together. You do not have to have that done for this month for homework. However, you will need to have done it to be able to do next month's homework. So you might as well get started on it. You should now have 41 5.5 inch blocks. Are going to finish at 5 inches. And they need to be arranged so your top row starts with 5 blocks and your bottom row ends with 5 blocks. There are 5 rows of 5 and then 4 rows of 4. It doesn't matter how you arrange them, whatever looks good to you, and then they're going to be sewn together in diagonal rows. I've sewn my blocks into rows. I haven't pressed them yet, and I have not sewn the rows together because I still need to do setting triangles all the way around to fill in those triangles. So that means it's time to cut my border fabric. I also wanted to point out that my arrangement may have changed from when I showed it before. I got partway through a row and couldn't remember which way it went, and I just picked which one I would liked. You will want to keep your appliques right side up. I've opened my piece of fabric for the borders flat, so it's not folded anymore. I am going to fold it, but I'm going to fold it so that I can cut my borders on the lengthwise grain. So I'm going to fold it down so that my borders on the same side of the fabric are together. Now remember, I have already cut a chunk out here for our Saltbox house. That's okay. I just want to make sure that when I'm cutting, I'm going to start over on the edge that I didn't cut that piece out of, so over here. And the first thing I'm going to do is cut off that selvage. Off camera, I went ahead and folded this one more time, so I have 4 layers here. Just going to be easier to reach across. So I'm going to just cut off the selvage. And to do that, as long as I had it all lined up straight, I mean selvage to selvage, and it's the same selvage on the same side, I'm lining up a line with my fold, and I'm going to cut. So now I have my straight edge to work from. The pattern says to cut my longest border 6.5 inches by 52 inches. With 1.5 yards of fabric, you actually have 54 inches. That 52 inches is already oversized, so I'm not going to try to cut it down to 52 inches. Now I'm going to cut this at 6.5, and I don't have a long 6.5 inch ruler. So what I'm doing is putting the 1/2 inch mark from one ruler on my cut edge, and then I'm butting another ruler up next to it that's 6 inches, so that gives me my 6.5. I want to check to make sure all the way down, and it is butted up. Then I'm going to cut, so that's my first long border. And then it says the next one should be 6.5 by 37. That's the shortest one, so I'm going to skip ahead to the next 2 longest ones, and they're supposed to be 37 inches long. I'm not worried about the fabric on the end because I've already figured out that I'm going to get it, and besides that I could get my 5 inch squares out of it if I needed to. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 more 6.5 inch strips just like the last one. Now I am cutting on the lengthwise grain. If you had cut on the crosswise grain, first thing is you would have had to piece it, and the second thing is cutting your borders on the lengthwise grain will make your quilt more stable, because the lengthwise grain is the direction that stretches the least, so your borders won't stretch out of shape. They'll help keep everything square. And cut. For my last shortest border, I have flipped the fabric around. This is where we cut out our piece for the sky in the Saltbox house. So again, I have my selvages, and I did make sure that my selvages are all matched up. I'm just going to cut a 6.5 inch piece from this side because I know that it is plenty long enough after just taking a 5.5 or even a 6 inch piece out of here. So again, I'm lining a line up with my fold so that I keep everything straight because I don't want zigzags where the folds were. So again, this one is 6.5. And the reason I flipped it around is I was just trying to avoid the fold. I don't think I'm going to need the whole width of the fabric, so then I don't have to press the fold that was in the fabric out. 6.5. Next, I need 4 10-inch squares, and if you don't have a ruler that's at least 10 inches, you can do exactly the same thing as I've been doing with the strips. I've got a 6-inch ruler, so I need another ruler to add 4 inches onto that. So I'm putting the 4-inch line over here, butting my longer ruler up against it, and cut. Now I actually do have a 10-inch ruler, or bigger than a 10-inch ruler, so I wouldn't have had to have done that. So I'm going to use it to cut my squares. I'm going to line this up. I want to make sure my cut edges are together, although we're going to be making triangles out of these and they are slightly oversized. So the first thing I'm doing is squaring up this end. I'm going to walk around and cut. I don't have big enough ruler to cut all of them at once. By that I mean a 20-inch and then cut them down, but it's not a big deal in this. So I'm going to cut, and rather than cutting my next 10-inch square, these are going to get cut in half twice on the diagonal to make quarter square triangles. So I'm going to just go ahead and do that before I move this square. Just do the best you can. They're a little bit oversized. We want them as accurate as we can get them. So that gives me 8 quarter square triangles. And the reason we're cutting quarter square triangles, these are the ones that are going to go on the edge of the quilt. And we want the straight of grain going vertically and horizontally, not the bias. So that's why it's quarter square and not half square. Move this forward. Cut another 10-inch square. And again, cut in half twice on the diagonal. My battery died midway through the second set of 10-inch squares, so I'm not sure exactly where it stopped and where I'm picking up. You're going to cut these exactly like you did the first set. So it's a total of 4 10-inch squares. If you don't want them stacked on top of each other, you don't have to. But that will give us 16 quarter square triangles. The last thing we need out of our border fabric is 2 5-inch squares, and this was my 10-inch strip that I already cut, so it's already at 10. So I'm going to cut it down to 5 inches wide, and I want to keep it straight if I can. And then because it was 10 inches wide, I can just back my ruler up to the 5-inch mark and cut. And these squares are going to get cut in half once on the diagonal because they are going to be the 4 corners of the quilt. And again, that means that our straight of grain is going to be on the outside edge. So I've arranged my setting triangles on there. We're not going to worry about the outside corners till everything else is together. When I go to sew these, I'm going to line up the straight edge, so the squared off corner, with my row of blocks. And I'll show you what I mean after I've done it. If you've been trying to follow my layout, I did switch a block. My personal philosophy on tearing it out is if I can tolerate it, it stays, but if it's going to bother me every time I look at it, then I'll change it. I added my setting triangles all the way around on the edges, and I think here you can see what I was talking about. My 90-degree angle is the one that I'm lining up with the blocks. The long angle is just going to be sewn right off the edge. We will be trimming that. I did press as I went, so I just alternated directions for the seams for each row. So one row I'd be pressing toward the right, the next row I'd be pressing toward the left. Now, there are some intersections that don't want to go where you want them to go, and I usually try to avoid steam when I'm quilting, but in this case, if the seams that I was pressing were being obstinate, I gave it a shot of steam, and then I put something heavy on top of it. You could use a foam book, a clapper, which is used in tailoring, wooden cutting board. So now I'm ready to sew the rows together to finish the center of the quilt. The pattern doesn't say anything about doing this, but I think it's going to make it easier to sew my rows together. So on the side where I have my long edge of my triangle sticking out, that's going to be scrap. So I'm going to go ahead and line my ruler up with my block and cut that straight across. That way I'm sewing straight across too, and I don't have to worry about where my seam's going on those triangles. So I'll do that on each row as I go. When I'm sewing my rows together, I'm not worrying about where my background triangles are hitting. What I want to match is my seams on my blocks in the center, because this is all going to get trimmed outside. So I don't care whether that is even out there or not. The rows are all sewn together, and I did press as I went. You can press any direction you want. It really doesn't matter. You could press the seams open. Pattern recommends pressing toward a bottom corner, and that is what I did. I need to add the 4 corners now, and 2 of my corners still have the long angle sticking out from my setting triangle, so I'm going to go ahead and trim those off, even with the square. Now, these triangles are smaller than this corner, and that's okay because we're going to be trimming it down. So what I'm going to do is fold this triangle in half and mark the center with a pin. And then if I didn't have this divided in half on this corner, I'd fold it in half too to find the corner. I'm going to match the centers up there and there, and then go ahead and sew the corner on. So I will sew all 4 corners on. I added my corner triangles and pressed out toward the triangles, and now I need to trim this quilt down around the edges because all the setting triangles were oversized. I'm going to use a square ruler in my corners. You don't have to, but it'll make life a little bit easier. So what we're supposed to be doing is trimming down so we have 1/4 of an inch beyond the points on our squares. I'm using a square ruler up here in the corners to get me started. And I'm more interested in keeping this straight than having it hit exactly at 1/4 of an inch. And also, right here, I've got 1/4 of an inch here, I've got 1/4 of an inch here, I've got 1/4 of an inch from this point, but here it's a little bit more than 1/4. I'm okay with a little bit of white showing. I would rather have that than cut off the points of my squares. So I'm putting the 1/4 inch mark on my points, and I am doing it on more than one. So when I'm happy that it's as close as I can get, I'm going to just trim off. And you could leave your quilt bigger than that if you wanted to. I think there's enough left. I mean, enough length on the borders that you could make it a little bit bigger. Doing the same thing on the next corner, and then I'm going to connect those together So again, I've got it as close as I can get it to quarters on all those points and still keep it square. Trying not to get a wonky shape. So now that I've squared off those two corners, I'm going to go ahead and connect up those cuts. I'm trying to just keep this thing as square as I possibly can. It's probably not going to be exact, but so I have a little bit more up here, but it's 1/4 of an inch here, and I'm okay with that. So I'm going to just do that all the way around the quilt, leaving my 1/4 inch seam allowance at least beyond the points in my squares. My quilt's all trimmed down as square as I can get it, and now it's time to start adding borders. We're going to add the top and bottom border pieces first, and if you followed the measurements in the pattern, that would be 2 of them that are 6.5 by 39. If you cut the way I did, you're going to have 3 borders that are the same length. Pick 2 of the longer ones, and that's what we're going to use. We need to know how long to cut those borders. You really don't want to just sew the borders onto the edge of your quilt and then cut them off, because that will cause wavy borders, and the reason it will do that is fabric stretches, and so you could get a whole bunch of fabric, extra fabric on there, or you could get too little fabric on there. So we're going to take a measurement in 3 places on the quilt, and I don't use 3 measuring tapes. I'm just doing that for the video so you can see. It should be somewhere around 36 inches. Mine's a little bit less. But you're probably not going to have exactly the same measurement in all 3 places. The pattern says take the smallest of the 3 measurements and cut your borders that size. I actually like to take my 3 measurements and take the average. So let's say I had one measurement that said 35, one that said 35.5, and one that said 35.25. I'm going to go with the 35.25. So you will need to measure your quilt. You can't base it on what my measurements are. You need to see what yours are. So measure it in 3 places, top, middle, bottom. It doesn't have to be right along the edge. And then cut your borders to either the smallest, as the pattern says, or an average of your 3 measurements. And do use the same measuring tape. I'm not going to take the measurements from these 3 separate ones. I'm going to use one measuring tape and get my 3 measurements. For my top and bottom borders, it turns out that my measurement is 35.5. So I have mine folded in half. Half of 35.5 is 17.75. So I'm going to line the 17.75 mark up on my fold. I'm going to line a long line along my cut edge, and my ruler is not 6.5 inches wide, so I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to move over to the other side and go 17.75. I do have a really big ruler that I could have done this with, a square one, but most of you aren't going to have that if you're not tool collectors like I am. So there's my first border. I'm going to cut the second one exactly the same way. I'm ready to sew the top and bottom borders onto my quilt center now. And I want my border to be evenly distributed on my quilt. So I folded the border in half, marked the center, and then I folded each end into the center and marked the 1/4 marks. I did exactly the same thing on the quilt. I want to match those points up, and then if there's any easing to be done while I'm sewing this, I want to ease between those so that if I had some extra somewhere, it doesn't all end up in one spot. So I'm going to go ahead and sew those, and I'll be pressing toward the borders. Our next step is with the shortest border. So we did have one that was shorter than the other, even if you cut the way I did. I have not squared up the short end yet, so I'm lining up lines on my long edges and cutting. And then I need to cut a 6.5 inch square off of this. So I'm gonna line up my 6.5 inch mark with the line, with the edge I just cut, the short edge. I'm also lining up lines with my long edges. I'm going to cut that off. Okay, so now this 6.5 inch square is going to be sewn to the bottom of our Saltbox house. And then the piece that we had left, the longer piece, is going to be sewn to the top of the house. You can't see it yet, so here we go. My Saltbox house, for some reason, ended up being a little bit wider than 6.5. So I'm just lining my 6.5-inch line along the edge of the house, not along the background. And I'm slicing the extra off. Because I want it to match the border. It is part of the border. I'm ready to add my side borders now. After sewing my border fabric to my Saltbox house, I pressed the bottom seam up because that one's going to match with my seam on the border fabric on the bottom of the quilt. And then my top seam I pressed up. So again, we're going to measure the quilt in 3 different places, and I know my measuring tape is not long enough on the right side. It's just there for a visual. So I'm going to measure in 3 places, and I'm going to take the average, or you can take the shortest length. The border that's on the left side is just a plain border, so it's going to be exactly like the top and bottom. We're going to cut to whatever measurement we come up with. The border with the Saltbox house in it, when we trim it, we only want to trim from the top because we want to leave the 6.5 inches down on the bottom to match up with the bottom border. So the 2 side borders on, and I pressed out toward the borders. And this is as far as I'll be going this month. As I said earlier in the video, you do not have to have the whole quilt together to get your free kit next month. You do need to have the 3 blocks together that I demoed this month. You will need to be this far to be able to do month 11's homework. So I would suggest you start on it. You just don't have to finish it all before class next month.